"You are just a burden in this house," my daughter-in-law said, looking me straight in the eyes as if she were commenting on the weather instead of dismantling what little remained of my life. I didn't answer her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even blink right away. I just stood there at the edge of the dining table, my fingers still resting on the back of the chair I had pulled out for myself, the same chair I had sat in for over 30 years, the same place where I had served meals, listened to stories, and believed I belonged. The room was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. The kind of quiet that settles in after something irreversible has been said. My son, Daniel, sat across from me, his eyes fixed on his plate as if the roasted chicken in front of him required his full attention. He didn't look at me. Not once. That silence from him was louder than anything Ashley could have said. I slowly lowered myself into the chair, even though I wasn't sure I was still welcome to sit there. The overhead light cast a soft glow across the polished wood table, reflecting faint outlines of our faces, distorted and distant, like we were already strangers. I picked up my fork, but I didn't eat. My hands were steady, which surprised me. At 71 years old, I had learned that sometimes the deepest wounds don't make you shake. They make you still. "We just think it's time to be practical," Ashley continued, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "This house is too much for you. It's not safe. And honestly, it's not fair for us to carry everything. Carry everything." I let those words settle in my mind. I thought about the mortgage Daniel never had to worry about, the property taxes that had always been paid on time, the kitchen renovations that I had carefully budgeted for down to the last dollar. The years I had spent keeping this house running long before Ashley ever walked through the front door with her perfectly styled hair and polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. I turned my head slightly and looked at her. Really looked at her. There was no anger in her expression. No hesitación. Just certainty. That was what struck me the most. Not cruelty. Certainty. As if she had already decided what my place was, and I was simply late to accept it. "Daniel," I said quietly, my voice even controlled. "Do you agree with this?" He shifted in his seat, finally lifting his eyes for just a second before looking away again. "Mom, it makes sense," he muttered. "Makes sense." I nodded once slowly. I didn't ask anything else. There was nothing left to ask. The conversation wasn't a discussion. It was a conclusion they had reached without me. I placed my fork down gently beside my plate, careful not to make any noise. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break, even in something as small as a trembling hand. "I understand," I said, and to my own surprise I meant it. Not in the way they expected. Not as acceptance, but as clarity. I understood exactly where I stood in that moment. And more importantly, I understood that they believed I had nowhere else to go, nothing else to rely on, and no power left to challenge them. That assumption hung in the air, unspoken but heavy, like the scent of the meal that no longer mattered. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The legs scraped softly against the hardwood floor. A small, ordinary sound that felt strangely final. Neither of them tried to stop me. Neither of them said my name. I walked out of the dining room and into the hallway, my steps measured, unhurried. The house felt different as I moved through it, as if it were already beginning to forget me. I paused at the staircase and rested my hand on the banister, tracing the smooth wood worn down by decades of use. My use. My life. Upstairs, my bedroom door was slightly open. The room still held the faint scent of my late husband's cologne, a subtle reminder of a time when this house had been filled with partnership instead of quiet calculations. It had only been a week since we buried him. 1 week since I had stood beside his grave, believing that the hardest part was saying goodbye. I walked into the bedroom and closed the door behind me, not with force, just enough to create a boundary. For a moment I stood there, looking at the familiar furniture, the framed photographs, the small details that told the story of a life built slowly, patiently over decades. I didn't cry. I didn't sit down right away. I simply breathed. In and out. Steady. Controlled. Because something inside me had shifted, not broken but sharpened. Downstairs I could hear faint movement, the clink of dishes, the low murmur of voices continuing as if nothing had happened. As if I had already been removed from the equation. I walked to the dresser and opened the top drawer, my fingers brushing against a stack of neatly folded documents. Papers I hadn't looked at in months. Papers my husband had insisted I keep safe. At the time I hadn't thought much about it. He had always been thorough, always careful. I closed the drawer gently without taking anything out. Not yet. Timing mattered. I turned off the lamp beside the bed, letting the room fall into a softer light, and sat down at the edge of the mattress. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not empty, not hollow, just still. And in that stillness one thought settled clearly in my mind, steady and undeniable. They believed I was a burden. They believed I was powerless. And that was going to be their first mistake. I did not sleep that night, not in the way people mean when they say they slept but felt restless. I mean I did not close my eyes at all. I lay there on my side of the bed staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above me, each rotation steady and indifferent, as if nothing in the world had changed, and yet everything had. The silence beside me was no longer just the absence of my husband, it had become something heavier, something that pressed down on my chest with a quiet persistence that made it difficult to breathe deeply. I kept my hands folded over the blanket, not gripping, not trembling, just resting there as if I were waiting for instructions that were never going to come. And sometime around 3 in the morning I sat up, not because I had reached a decision, but because staying still any longer felt like surrender. The hallway was dim, lit only by the small night light near the stairs, and as I walked past the family photos on the wall I slowed down. Without meaning to, my eyes tracing the images one by one, birthdays, graduations, holidays, moments carefully framed and preserved. There was one of Daniel at age 8 standing in the backyard holding a baseball glove that was too big for his hand, smiling up at me as if I were the center of his world. I paused there for a second longer than I should have, then moved on, because that version of him did not exist in the dining room anymore. In the kitchen I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the sink looking out into the dark backyard, the same yard I had planted with my husband more than 20 years ago. The oak tree we had argued about because it seemed too small at the time now stood tall and steady, rooted in a way that felt almost ironic. I took a slow sip and set the glass down carefully, listening to the faint sound it made against the countertop. Everything in the house still belonged to routine, but I no longer belonged to it, and that thought did not bring tears. It brought clarity. I turned off the kitchen light and walked back upstairs, but instead of returning to bed I sat at the small desk by the window, the one I used for bills and letters, and I opened the drawer again. This time I took the documents out. The paper felt familiar in my hands, slightly worn at the edges from being handled years ago and then forgotten. I spread them out in front of me, reading slowly, not because I could not understand the words, but because I wanted to absorb every detail without missing anything. My husband had always been precise, careful with numbers, deliberate with decisions, and as I read through the pages I could almost hear his voice explaining things the way he used to, calm and patient, never rushing. There were notes in the margins in his handwriting, small reminders, underlined phrases, things he had wanted to make sure I noticed. I followed each line, each clause, until the structure of it all became clear in a way it never had before. And when I reached the final page I sat back in the chair and let out a breath I had not realized I had been holding. Not relief, not yet, but something close to it, something that felt like the beginning of control. I gathered the papers and placed them back into the envelope, smoothing it flat before returning it to the drawer, not hiding it, just keeping it where it belonged. For now, the sky outside the window had begun to lighten slightly, a soft gray replacing the darkness, and I watched it for a moment before standing up. My body felt tired, but my mind was steady in a way it had not been the night before. I changed out of my nightgown and into something simple, a blouse and a pair of slacks, nothing formal, nothing that would draw attention, just enough to step outside without explanation. When I walked downstairs the house was still quiet. Daniel and Ashley had not come up to check on me, they had not knocked on my door, they had not asked if I was all right, and I found that I did not expect them to. I picked up my handbag from the chair near the front door and slipped on my shoes, pausing only briefly as I glanced back toward the dining room. The table was still set from the night before, plates half cleared, glasses left where they had been, a frozen moment of a conversation that had already ended. I turned the handle and stepped outside into the cool morning air, closing the door gently behind me. The street was quiet, a few cars parked along the curb, the same neighbors' houses lining the block as they had for years. Everything looked familiar, unchanged, and yet I felt like I was seeing it from a distance, as if I had already begun to separate from it. I walked to my car, the same one I had driven to the grocery store, to church, to doctor appointments, the same routine paths that had defined my days. and I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I did not rush, there was no need to. When I finally pulled out of the driveway, I did not look back at the house in the rearview mirror. Not because it did not matter, but because I already knew what was there. And I knew what was waiting for me inside if I returned too soon. Instead, I focused on the road ahead. The early morning light stretching across it in long, quiet lines, and as I drove through the familiar streets toward the center of town, one thought stayed with me, steady and certain. They believed they had already decided my future, but they had made that decision without understanding the past, and that difference was going to matter more than they realized. I parked across the street from the bank and sat there for a moment with the engine still running, watching the glass doors reflect the early morning light. The building looked exactly as it always had, quiet, orderly, dependable, a place where numbers made sense and decisions were written down in black and white, not whispered across a dinner table and disguised as concern. I turned off the engine and rested my hands in my lap, taking one steady breath before opening the door and stepping out. Into the crisp air, the sound of my shoes against the pavement felt louder than usual, or maybe I was just noticing it for the first time. Inside, the bank was nearly empty, a single teller behind the counter organizing papers, a man in a suit seated at a desk flipping through a folder. Everything moved at a measured pace, no urgency, no tension, just routine. I approached the front desk and offered a small, polite smile, the kind I had practiced for years, the kind that revealed nothing. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm even. "I would like to speak with someone about reviewing my accounts and any estate documents connected to my late husband." The teller nodded and asked me to wait, her tone respectful, neutral. She did not know that this was not just about accounts. It was about understanding what had been quietly placed into my hands long before I realized I would need it. I sat down in one of the chairs near the window, folding my hands neatly in my lap, the same way I had the night before, only now there was no confusion behind the stillness, only focus. After a few minutes, the man in the suit stood and walked toward me, introducing himself as Mr. Harris, his handshake firm but not overbearing, his expression attentive. He led me into a private office with a glass wall that allowed light to pass through. Without exposing the conversation, a space designed for discretion, for clarity, for truth, I took a seat across from him and placed my handbag carefully on the floor beside me. "How can I assist you today, Mrs. Collins?" he asked, opening a notepad. I met his eyes briefly, then lowered my gaze to the desk, not out of hesitation but out of habit, a lifetime of choosing when to speak and when to observe. "My husband handled most of our financial matters," I began, choosing each word with care. "He passed away recently and I would like to understand exactly what has been left in my name, including any accounts, properties or legal arrangements." Mr. Harris nodded, his pen moving across the page. "Of course, do you have any documentation with you?" I shook my head slightly. "Not today, but I believe everything is already filed here." There was a brief pause as he typed into his computer, his eyes scanning the screen as lines of information appeared. I watched his expression change, not dramatically, but enough to notice, a subtle shift from routine to something more attentive, more precise. He clicked through several tabs, his posture straightening just a little. "Yes, Mrs. Collins," he said slowly. "We do have extensive records connected to your husband's accounts." Extensive, I let the word settle. It sounded larger than I expected, heavier, more deliberate. "There are multiple accounts, as well as a trust arrangement and property documentation," he continued, his tone now slightly more formal. "Most of these appear to be structured with you as the primary beneficiary." I nodded once, keeping my expression neutral, as if this were simply confirmation of something ordinary, even though I could feel the quiet alignment of pieces inside my mind. "I would like to review everything," I said, "in detail." He turned the monitor slightly so I could see, scrolling through documents, account balances, dates, signatures, each line a small piece of a larger structure that had been built carefully, intentionally, long before last night's conversation ever took place. I recognized my husband's name on nearly every page, his signature steady and unmistakable. And then I saw mine added later in places I barely remembered signing, moments when he had asked me to trust him, to put my name where it mattered. I had not questioned him then, and now I understood why. "There is also a clause attached to the primary trust," Mr. Harris said, pausing as he opened another document. "It outlines specific conditions regarding property occupancy and transfer rights." I leaned slightly forward, my attention narrowing. "What kind of conditions?" I asked, my voice still calm, still controlled. He adjusted his glasses and read carefully. The primary residence cannot be sold, transferred, or reassigned without your direct authorization, and any co-occupants do not hold ownership rights unless explicitly granted by you. The words were clear, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. I felt something settle into place inside me, not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty, the kind that does not need to be expressed to be understood. I sat back in my chair, my hands resting lightly on the armrests, and nodded once. I see, I said quietly. Mr. Harris continued. Additionally, there are protections in place that prevent any changes to the structure of the trust without your approval. Protections. I repeated the word silently, not because I doubted it, but because I was beginning to understand the depth of what had been arranged. My husband had not just left things behind. He had anticipated. He had prepared. He had built something that extended beyond his absence, something that could not be easily undone by assumption or pressure or a carefully timed conversation at a dinner table. I glanced at the documents one more time, then looked back at Mr. Harris. Thank you, I said, standing slowly. I would like copies of everything. He nodded immediately. Of course, I will have those prepared for you. As I waited, I stood by the window, looking out at the street where I had parked my car. The same street I had driven down without looking back. And for the first time since the night before, I allowed myself a small, quiet acknowledgement, not of what had been taken from me, but of what had never been theirs to take. When Mr. Harris handed me the folder, neatly organized and clipped together, I accepted it with both hands, holding it carefully, not as something fragile, but as something final, something real. I thanked him again and walked out of the office, through the quiet lobby, and back into the morning light. The air felt the same as before, cool, steady, unchanged. But I was not, because now I understood something they did not, something they had not even considered. They believed I was a burden in that house, but they had no idea whose house it truly was. I did not rush home after leaving the bank, even though every part of me understood that what I now carried in my handbag had the power to change everything waiting behind that front door. Instead, I drove slowly through familiar streets, passing the grocery store where I had shopped every Thursday for years, the small cafe on the corner where my husband and I used to sit on quiet afternoons, the park where Daniel learned how to ride his first bicycle. Each place held a memory, and each memory felt like a reminder of how long I had been building a life that others now believed they could rearrange without me. I eventually turned back toward the neighborhood, easing the car into the driveway as if nothing had shifted, as if I were returning from an ordinary errand. The house stood there exactly the same, unchanged, silent, holding within it a version of reality that no longer matched my understanding. I stepped out of the car, closed the door gently, and walked to the front entrance. With the same steady pace I had used when leaving earlier that morning, when I opened the door, I was met with the faint sound of movement inside. Voices low but present. Ashley's voice carried first, light but controlled, followed by Daniel's, quieter, less certain. I paused just inside the doorway, not hiding, not announcing myself either, simply listening. We need to start making decisions soon, Ashley was saying, her tone measured, practical, as if she were discussing a renovation schedule instead of someone's life. The longer we wait, the more complicated it becomes. There was a brief silence before Daniel responded. I know, but maybe we should give her a little more time. His voice lacked conviction. It sounded like an obligation rather than a belief. Time for what? Ashley replied, her voice sharpening just slightly. She is not going to change the situation, Daniel. This house is too much for her, and we cannot keep putting our plans on hold. I stepped fully into the hallway then, letting the sound of the door closing behind me announce my presence. The conversation stopped immediately. The silence that followed was quick, controlled, like a curtain being pulled across a stage. I walked into the kitchen, placing my handbag on the counter with deliberate care. Good morning, I said, my tone calm, neutral, as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. Ashley turned toward me first, her expression composed, almost pleasant, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes, calculation perhaps, or the quick adjustment of someone who had not expected me to return so soon. You are back early, she said, offering a small smile that did not quite settle. I nodded once. I had a few things to take care of, I replied, keeping my voice even. Daniel stood near the table, his posture slightly tense, his eyes moving between us as if trying to anticipate the direction of the conversation. I did not look at him right away. Instead, I walked to the sink and poured myself a glass of water, repeating the same small action from earlier, grounding myself in something simple, something controlled. We were just talking, Ashley added, her voice smoothing out again. About making sure everything is manageable going forward. Manageable, the word hung there, carefully chosen, carefully placed. I turned slightly, leaning against the counter, the glass cool in my hand. That sounds important, I said, offering no resistance, no challenge, just acknowledgement. Ashley seemed to relax a fraction, encouraged perhaps by the absence of conflict. It is, she continued, stepping closer. We all need to be realistic about what works best for everyone. I nodded again, slowly, as if considering her words with genuine thought. I agree, I said, and this time both of them looked at me, truly looked, because that was not the response they expected. I could see it in the slight narrowing of Ashley's eyes, the brief lift of Daniel's head. You do? Daniel asked, his voice uncertain. I met his gaze then, steady, calm. Yes, I replied. I think it is important to be practical. The word echoed back to them, familiar now but different in my mouth. I took a small sip of water and set the glass down carefully on the counter. In fact, I continued, I have been thinking about what comes next. Ashley's posture shifted, her attention sharpening. She stepped a little closer, drawn in by the possibility of agreement, of resolution on her terms. That is good, she said quickly, because we really do need to start planning. I inclined my head slightly as if conceding the point. Yes, I said. Planning is exactly what we should be doing. There was a brief pause, the kind that invites expectation, that allows others to fill in the outcome they want, and I let that pause sit there, letting them believe they understood what I was about to say, letting them feel, just for a moment, that control had shifted in their favor. Daniel exhaled. Softly, a small release of tension. Ashley's shoulders eased, her confidence settling back into place, and in that quiet shift, I saw it clearly. They were already imagining the next steps without me, already arranging the pieces of a future that did not include my presence. I straightened slightly, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, my posture calm, unthreatening. I will need a little time, I said, my voice measured, to organize a few things. Ashley nodded quickly. Of course, she said. That is reasonable. Reasonable. I let the word pass without reaction. Daniel looked relieved, as if the situation had resolved itself without requiring him to take a side. Thank you, he added quietly. I gave a small nod in return, then turned back toward the sink, picking up the glass again, not because I needed another sip, but because it gave me a reason to step away from their expectations, from their assumptions, from the version of events they believed was unfolding. Behind me I could hear their quiet exchange, low voices, controlled already. Moving forward, already planning, and I stood there, facing the window, looking out at the same backyard I had seen that morning, the oak tree steady in the sunlight, unchanged, rooted, and for the first time since the night before, I allowed myself a single quiet thought that did not need to be spoken. They believed I was preparing to leave, but what I was really doing was preparing to stay, and this time it would be on my terms. I moved through the rest of the day as if everything had settled into a quiet understanding, but it was not the kind they believed it to be. It was mine, carefully formed, held beneath the surface where it could not be interrupted. I kept my routine intact, not out of habit, but out of intention. I folded laundry in the afternoon, placing each piece neatly in its place. I prepared dinner at the usual time, measuring ingredients with the same care I always had. The scent of garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen, familiar and steady, and when I set the table, I used the same dishes, the same arrangement. Nothing changed on the surface, because change, when done correctly, does not announce itself, it unfolds quietly. Daniel came home first, his footsteps heavier than usual, his presence uncertain as he stepped into the kitchen and paused for a moment, watching me as if he were trying to understand something that no longer fit into his expectations. Smells good, he said, his voice soft, almost cautious. I nodded slightly without turning around. Dinner will be ready in a few minutes, I replied, my tone even, unchanged. Ashley arrived shortly after, her movements brisk, controlled. She placed her bag on the chair and glanced around the room, her eyes moving quickly, assessing, measuring, as if looking for signs of resistance or disruption. But there were none, only order, only calm, and that seemed to reassure her. We sat down together, the three of us, the same positions as the night before, the same light above us, the same table beneath our hands, but something fundamental had shifted. Not in them, but in me. I served the food without hesitation, passing plates, filling glasses, my hands steady, my movements precise. I did not rush, I did not linger, I simply moved through each step with quiet control. For a while no one spoke, the sound of utensils against plates filled the space, small, controlled, predictable. And then Ashley set her fork down, her posture straightening slightly, signaling the beginning of something she had already prepared to say. "We should probably talk about next steps," she began, her voice smooth, composed. I looked up at her, meeting her eyes directly for a brief moment before lowering my gaze again, not submissive, not withdrawn, simply measured. "Of course," I said, giving her the space she expected. Daniel shifted in his seat, his shoulders tightening, but he did not interrupt. Ashley continued, "I think it would be best if we start looking at options for you, somewhere more suitable, somewhere easier to manage." Suitable, easier, the words came dressed in concern, but they carried the same intention as before. Only now they were softened, refined, made to sound reasonable. I nodded slowly as if considering each word. "That makes sense," I said, and again both of them paused, the agreement landing in a way they did not anticipate. Ashley's expression flickered. Just for a moment, not doubt but recalibration. She was adjusting, trying to understand why there was no resistance. Daniel glanced at me, his eyes searching, perhaps for a sign of emotion, of hesitation, of something he could respond to. But there was none. I continued eating, calmly, deliberately, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for them to lean into it, for them to believe they were moving forward. "I can start packing some things," I added after a moment, my voice steady. "Organizing what I need and what can be left behind." Ashley nodded quickly, relief settling into her posture. "That would be helpful," she said, her tone lighter now, as if a burden had already been lifted. The word did not escape me, but I did not react to it. Daniel exhaled softly, his shoulders easing as if the tension he had been holding was no longer necessary. I finished my meal and placed my fork down neatly beside my plate. "I will take care of it," I said, standing slowly, gathering the dishes one by one, moving toward the sink with the same measured pace. Behind me, I could hear their quiet exchange, low voices, plans beginning to form, timelines being considered, details discussed as if the outcome were already certain. I turned on the water and began rinsing the plates, the steady stream filling the silence with something controlled, something neutral. I did not listen to their words, not because they did not matter, but because I already knew what they believed, and more importantly, I knew what they did not. When the dishes were done, I dried my hands carefully and turned off the light above the sink, leaving the kitchen in a softer glow. I walked past them without interruption, without acknowledgement, not out of dismissal, but because there was nothing left to say in that moment. Upstairs, I entered my bedroom and closed the door behind me, the same quiet boundary as before. I moved to the dresser and opened the drawer, taking out the folder I had received. That morning, I placed it on the bed and sat beside it, resting my hand lightly on the cover. Not opening it yet, not needing to, because the understanding was already there, clear, steady, unshaken. I looked around the room at the photographs, the furniture, the life that had been built piece by piece over decades, and I allowed myself a small, controlled breath, not of relief, not of sadness, but of recognition. This was not something that could be taken away with a conversation. It was something that had been secured long before they decided to act. I stood up and walked to the closet, pulling out an empty suitcase and setting it on the bed. I unzipped it slowly, the sound soft but deliberate, and began placing items inside, not everything, not even most things, just enough to create the appearance of movement, of transition, of compliance, each item folded carefully, placed with intention, a performance built on precision. Downstairs, I could hear faint laughter now, lighter, more relaxed, as if a decision had already been finalized, as if the future had already been arranged in their favor. I paused for a moment, my hands resting on the edge of the suitcase, and allowed the sound to settle in the background, not disturbing me, not influencing me, just existing. And in that quiet moment, I understood exactly what I needed to do next, not quickly, not loudly, but with the same calm, steady control that had carried me through every step so far. They believed I was preparing to leave, but in reality I was preparing them for what was coming, and when it arrived it would not need to be explained. The next morning unfolded with the same quiet rhythm I had established, but beneath it, every movement carried intention, every small action placed exactly where it needed to be. I woke early, before either of them, and made my way downstairs, the house still wrapped in that soft pre-dawn silence that makes everything feel suspended. I brewed coffee the way I always had, measuring the grounds carefully, pouring the water slowly, allowing the familiar scent to fill the kitchen, grounding me in something steady, something that belonged to me. I sat at the table with a single cup, my hands wrapped around it, not for warmth but for focus, and I allowed myself a few moments to think clearly, not about what had happened, but about what would happen next. Timing mattered now, not emotion, not reaction, just timing. When Daniel came down, his steps hesitant on the stairs, he paused when he saw me already seated, as if he had expected to find the house empty or at least different. "You are up early," he said, his voice careful. I nodded slightly, lifting the cup to my lips. "I have always been an early riser," I replied, my tone neutral. He stood there for a moment, uncertain, then walked to the counter and poured himself a glass of water, his movements quieter than usual, as if he were trying not to disturb something fragile. Ashley entered a few minutes later, dressed neatly, her expression composed. She glanced at the suitcase I had left partially visible near the hallway the night before, and I saw it then, that subtle shift in her posture, the quiet confirmation she had been waiting for. She believed the process had already begun, that everything was moving exactly as she had planned. "That is a good start," she said lightly, gesturing toward the suitcase, her tone almost approving. I followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at my coffee. "There is still more to organize," I said calmly, offering just enough agreement to keep her confidence intact. Daniel looked between us, his brow tightening slightly, perhaps sensing something he could not quite name. But he said nothing, and that silence once again worked in my favor. I finished my coffee and stood, rinsing the cup in the sink with the same steady precision. "I have a few errands to run today," I added, not asking, not explaining, just stating. Ashley nodded quickly. "Of course, that makes sense," she said, her voice smooth. "If you need help with anything, just let us know." The offer was there, but it was not meant to be accepted. It was meant to reinforce the idea that I was being guided, managed, transitioned. I dried my hands and picked up my handbag, the weight of the folder inside it reassuring, not because it was heavy, but because it was certain. As I moved toward the door, Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Mom, if you need time, we can adjust things." The sentence trailed off, incomplete, unsure. I turned slightly, meeting his eyes for a brief moment, and for the first time, I saw something there that had not been present before, not defiance, not agreement, but doubt, small, quiet, and late. "I appreciate that," I said simply, not offering more, because more was not necessary. I stepped outside into the morning air, closing the door behind me with the same measured care, and as I walked to my car, I allowed myself a single quiet acknowledgement, not of him, not of Ashley, but of the shift that had already begun. Doubt, once introduced, does not disappear easily. It lingers, it grows, it changes the way people see what they thought was certain, and that would matter later. I drove to a small office building on the other side of town, one I had not visited in years. The sign outside still read the same name, the same law firm my husband had trusted for decades. I parked and sat for a moment, not out of hesitation, but to steady the pace. Everything I did now had to remain consistent, controlled, without sudden movement or unnecessary urgency. Inside, the receptionist greeted me politely, and when I gave my name, there was a brief moment of recognition, followed by immediate professionalism. I was shown into an office where an older man stood to greet me, his expression respectful, his demeanor calm. "Mrs. Collins," he said, extending his hand. "I am very sorry for your loss." I nodded once, accepting the sentiment without allowing it to pull me backward. "Thank you," I replied, taking a seat across from him. I placed my handbag on the desk and opened it carefully, removing the folder and setting it between us. "I would like to review these documents with you," I said, my voice steady, "and understand exactly what protections are in place." He adjusted his glasses and opened the folder, scanning the pages with practiced attention, his eyes moving quickly, then slowing as he reached certain sections, his expression shifting slightly, not surprise but recognition of something well-structured, well-considered. "Your husband was very thorough," he said after a moment, his tone carrying a quiet respect. I inclined my head slightly. "He always was," I replied, and for a brief moment there was something like warmth in that acknowledgement, not grief, not pain, but appreciation for what had been done, what had been prepared. He continued reviewing the documents, pointing out specific clauses, reinforcing what I had already begun to understand, but hearing it spoken aloud, confirmed by someone who dealt in certainty, gave it a different weight, a finality that settled firmly into place. "No one can make changes to this arrangement without your direct consent," he said clearly, "and any attempt to do so would not hold up legally." I nodded once, absorbing the words without outward reaction, because inside, the structure had already been accepted, already integrated into the plan that was quietly forming. "Good," I said simply, closing the folder and placing it back into my handbag. Not lingering, not asking unnecessary questions, Because clarity had already been achieved, when I stood to leave, he offered a final, respectful nod, and I returned it with the same calm composure I had carried throughout. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting sharper light across the parking lot. Everything looked clear, defined, without shadows to obscure the edges, and as I walked back to my car, I understood that the next step would not require confrontation. Not yet. It would require patience, precision, and the willingness to let them continue believing exactly what they wanted to believe, because the more certain they felt, the more complete their mistake would become. And when the moment arrived, it would not need to be forced, it would simply unfold, exactly as it was meant to. When I returned home that afternoon, I did not go inside right away. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not thinking about what I had just confirmed, but about how it needed to unfold from here. Timing again mattered more than anything else. I stepped out and closed the door quietly, walking up the path with the same measured pace I had used all day. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. When I entered the house, I immediately noticed the subtle changes, small things but deliberate. The stack of mail that was usually left untouched on the side table had been opened and sorted. The decorative bowl near the entryway had been moved slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for me. This was no longer just a shared space, it was becoming theirs in their minds, piece by piece. I set my handbag down and moved into the living room. Ashley was seated on the couch with her laptop open. Her posture relaxed, her expression focused in a way that suggested she was not simply browsing. She looked up briefly when she saw me, offering a polite smile. "You are back," she said, her tone light. I nodded. "Yes," I replied simply, and continued past her without asking what she was doing, because I already had a sense Daniel was not home yet, his absence noticeable in the quiet. Ashley turned her attention back to the screen, but I slowed my steps just slightly as I passed behind her. Not stopping, not staring. Just enough to catch a glimpse. Spreadsheets, listings, figures. I did not need to see more. I moved into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The same action, the same steady motion, grounding everything in normalcy. A few minutes later, Ashley joined me, closing her laptop as she entered, her expression composed, but there was a brightness in her eyes now, something sharper, more certain. "I have been looking at a few options," she said, leaning lightly against the counter. "Some places that might be a good fit for you." I turned slightly, meeting her gaze briefly, then looking back at the glass in my hand. "That sounds thoughtful," I said, my tone even. She smiled, encouraged. "I think it will make everything easier," she continued, "for all of us." I nodded once, allowing the words to settle without challenge. "I am sure it will," I replied. She hesitated for a moment, as if expecting more, but when none came, she continued. "There is a community about 15 miles from here, very nice, well maintained. They have activities, support, everything you would need." 15 miles. I noted the distance without reacting. Not too far, not too close, convenient, controlled. I took a small sip of water and set the glass down carefully. "It is good to explore options," I said, and again that slight shift in her posture, that quiet satisfaction. She believed the conversation was moving forward exactly as she intended. Daniel arrived shortly after, his footsteps heavier, his presence more uncertain than before. He glanced between us, sensing the dynamic but not fully understanding it. Ashley turned toward him immediately, her tone light. "I was just telling your mother about some places I found," she said, as if presenting progress, as if offering something beneficial. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes moving to me, searching again, always searching. "That sounds helpful," he said, though the hesitation remained. I met his gaze briefly, then looked away, not dismissive, just controlled. "We are making plans," I said simply, and that seemed to settle something in him, not entirely but enough. Dinner that evening followed the same pattern as the night before. Calm, orderly, predictable. I served the meal, set the table, moved through each step with the same precision. And once again, the conversation turned toward timelines. Ashley spoke more confidently now, outlining ideas, suggesting steps, her words flowing easily, as if the outcome were already agreed upon. Daniel contributed occasionally, but his voice lacked the same certainty. He followed her lead as he had the night before, as he had likely done many times before. I noticed. I listened without interrupting, without correcting, allowing them to build their version of events fully, completely, because the more complete it became, the more fragile it would be when it finally met reality. After dinner, I cleared the table and moved to the sink, the sound of running water filling the space, masking their quiet conversation behind me. I did not need to hear every word. I already understood the direction. When I finished, I dried my hands and turned off the light, leaving the kitchen dim, the house settling into evening. I walked upstairs without a word. The same quiet withdrawal, the same controlled exit in my room. The suitcase remained open on the bed, partially filled, a visible sign of movement, of compliance. I added a few more items, not because I needed to, but because it reinforced the illusion, each piece placed carefully, deliberately. I paused then, my hands resting on the edge of the suitcase, and listened. Faint voices from downstairs, lighter now, more relaxed, as if the uncertainty had been replaced with confidence. I closed the suitcase halfway, leaving it not fully packed, not fully empty, exactly in between, and I understood then that everything was exactly where it needed to be. They believed I was following their plan, they believed I was preparing to leave, and in that belief they were revealing everything, their intentions, their assumptions, their expectations, and I allowed myself a single quiet breath, not of relief, not of satisfaction, but of readiness, because the moment they were building toward was not the one they thought, and when it arrived, it would not require force, it would only require truth, placed carefully, at exactly the right time. The following morning carried a different weight, not heavier but sharper, like the air just before a storm that had not yet arrived. I woke at the same hour, moved through the same quiet routine, but every step felt more deliberate, more defined, as if I were no longer moving through my life but positioning myself within it. Downstairs, the house was still, the early light filtering through the windows in long, pale lines across the floor. I prepared coffee again, the familiar rhythm grounding me, but this time, I did not sit for long. I had already decided what needed to happen today, and hesitation no longer served a purpose. I walked back upstairs and dressed with care, not formally, not noticeably different, but intentional, every detail chosen with quiet precision. When I came back down, Ashley was already in the kitchen, her posture upright, her movements efficient. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes flickering toward the suitcase that remained visible in the hallway, still partially filled, still telling the story she wanted to believe. "Good morning," she said, her tone light, almost pleasant. I nodded. "Good morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. She hesitated for a moment, then continued, "I made an appointment for you to tour that community I mentioned. It is tomorrow at 10 in the morning. Her voice carried a quiet confidence, as if the plan were already set, as if my agreement were a formality rather than a choice. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle before responding. "That was thoughtful," I said, my tone even. She smiled, encouraged. "I think you will really like it," she added. "It will make things easier for everyone." Easier again, the word returned, dressed in kindness, carrying expectation. I set the cup down gently. "Tomorrow might be difficult," I said, not refusing, not resisting, just adjusting. Her expression shifted slightly, not frustration but recalculation. "We can reschedule if needed," she said quickly. "It is important that we keep moving forward." I nodded once. "We will," I replied. Leaving the sentence open, undefined, Daniel entered a few moments later, his presence quieter than usual. He greeted us both, but his attention lingered on me, as if he were still trying to understand something that remained just out of reach. "I was thinking," I said after a brief pause, my voice calm, controlled, "it might be a good idea for all of us to sit down together later today, just to make sure everything is clear." Ashley's eyes sharpened slightly, interest replacing ease. "About what?" she asked, her tone neutral but alert. I met her gaze briefly, then looked back at the table. "About the house," I said simply. Daniel shifted beside her, his posture tightening. "What do you mean?" he asked. I kept my hands resting lightly on the table, my voice steady. "We are making decisions. It is important that we all understand exactly where things stand." Ashley studied me for a moment, her expression controlled, searching for resistance, for hesitation, for anything that might disrupt the narrative she had built, but there was none, only calm, only clarity. "That makes sense," she said finally, her tone measured. "We should all be on the same page." I nodded. "Exactly," I replied, the words settling between us with a quiet finality. The rest of the morning moved forward without disruption. Daniel left for work, his departure quieter than usual. Ashley remained home, her movements purposeful, her attention divided between her phone and her laptop. I moved through the house as I always had, folding clothes, organizing small spaces, maintaining the rhythm that had defined my presence for years. But now, every action carried a different meaning, not maintenance, but positioning. I did not rush, I did not change my pace, because the moment I was preparing for did not require urgency. It required precision. By the afternoon, everything was in place, the documents were in my handbag, the conversation had been set, and the illusion remained intact. They still believed I was following their plan, that I was moving toward the exit they had prepared, and that belief was the final piece. When Daniel returned that evening, there was a quiet tension in the air, not conflict, not yet, but anticipation. Ashley greeted him with a brief update, her voice low, controlled, and I watched the exchange from across the room, not interrupting, not inserting myself, simply observing. Waiting. When we sat down for dinner, the table was set as it always had been, the same arrangement, the same quiet order, but beneath it, everything had changed. I served the meal, placed the dishes, moved through each step with the same steady control, and when we were all seated, I allowed a moment of silence to settle, not forced, not dramatic, just enough to shift the focus. "We should talk now," I said, my voice calm, even, and both of them looked at me, their attention immediate. Ashley straightened slightly, her posture alert. Daniel's expression tightened, uncertainty returning. I folded my hands lightly on the table, not gripping, not tense, simply placed, and in that moment, I felt the quiet alignment of everything that had led here, every word, every silence, every step, all converging into a single point of clarity. I did not raise my voice, I did not rush my words, because what I was about to say did not need force, it only needed to be heard. And as I looked at them, at the confidence in Ashley's expression, at the uncertainty in Daniel's eyes, I understood that the moment they had been preparing for was not the one that was about to unfold. It was something else entirely, something they had not considered, something they were not ready for. And I allowed myself one final quiet breath before speaking, knowing that once it began, there would be no need to explain anything further, because the truth, when placed correctly, does not require repetition, it simply stands. I did not raise my voice when I began speaking, and that was the first thing that unsettled them, because they were prepared for resistance, for emotion, for something they could push against, but I offered none of that. I simply reached for my handbag, opened it with steady hands, and placed the folder on the table between us. The sound of it settling against the wood was soft, almost unremarkable, and yet it drew both of their eyes immediately. Ashley's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second before smoothing out again. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to anticipate what he was about to hear. "Before we make any decisions," I said calmly, "I thought it would be important for us to understand exactly what we are working with." My voice remained even, measured, not confrontational, not defensive, just clear. Ashley crossed her hands lightly in front of her, her posture controlled. "Of course," she said, her tone polite. But there was a tension beneath it now, a subtle shift. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the folder. I opened it carefully, not rushing, turning the first page so that it faced them, not pushing it toward them, just placing it where it could be seen. "Your father handled most of the financial arrangements," I continued, looking at Daniel briefly, "but he made sure everything was documented." Daniel swallowed slightly, his throat tightening. "What is this?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. I rested my hands lightly on the edges of the paper, not gripping, not anchoring, just steady. "It is the structure of the estate," I said, "including the house." Ashley leaned forward slightly, her eyes scanning the page quickly, her confidence still present, but now mixed with something else, something sharper, more cautious. "We already know the house was in his name," she said, her tone controlled, as if reinforcing a point she believed to be settled. I nodded once. "Yes," I replied. "And he made very specific decisions about what would happen after he passed." I turned the page slowly, allowing the next section to come into view. Daniel's eyes followed the movement, his focus narrowing. Ashley's posture stiffened just slightly, her attention now fully engaged. "The house cannot be sold, transferred, or reassigned without my direct authorization," I said, my voice calm, each word placed carefully, deliberately. The silence that followed was immediate, complete. Daniel blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice unsteady. I met his gaze, not with challenge, not with anger, but with clarity. "I mean that the house does not belong to you," I said simply. Ashley straightened, her composure tightening. "That does not make sense," she said quickly, her voice controlled but sharper now. "You said yourself everything was in his name." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without conceding anything. "It was," I replied. "And then it was placed into a trust, with me as the primary beneficiary." I turned another page, sliding it slightly closer, not forcing it, just allowing it to be seen more clearly. And there are protections in place, I added, that prevent any changes without my approval. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hand moving to his forehead as if trying to process something that did not align with what he had believed. So what does that mean? He asked, his voice lower now, uncertain. I folded my hands lightly in front of me, resting them on the table. It means that no one can make decisions about this house without me, I said. Ashley's expression hardened, not openly, but in the tightening of her jaw, the narrowing of her eyes, the careful control of someone recalculating in real time. We were just trying to help, she said, her tone shifting slightly, moving from certainty to justification. I looked at her then, fully, holding her gaze for a moment, not aggressively, just steadily. I understand that, I said, and for the first time there was something in my voice that carried weight beyond calm, not anger, not accusation, but finality. But help does not require removing someone from their own home. The words settled between us, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, his eyes searching, not for confirmation but for understanding. You are not leaving? He asked, the question quiet, almost hesitant. I held his gaze for a moment, then shook my head once slowly. No, I said simply. Ashley inhaled sharply, just enough for the shift to be heard, her composure tightening further. That is not what we agreed on, she said, and there it was, the assumption laid bare, the belief that agreement had already been reached. I did not react to the statement, I did not correct it, I simply let it stand for what it was. There was no agreement, I replied calmly. There was only an assumption. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, the weight of the realization settling in. Ashley's posture remained rigid, controlled, but the certainty that had defined her was no longer complete. It had fractured, just enough. I closed the folder gently, the papers aligning neatly as I did, and placed my hand on top of it, not possessively, just firmly. I will be staying here, I said, my voice steady. And any decisions about this house will be made by me. I did not raise my tone. I did not repeat myself because there was no need. The words were clear, complete, sufficient. The silence that followed was different from before, not empty, not uncertain, but settled, as if something had shifted into its proper place. Daniel looked down at the table, his hands resting motionless. Ashley sat back slowly, her expression controlled, but no longer confident, and I remained where I was, my posture unchanged, my hands steady, because this was not about winning, it was about clarity, about truth placed exactly where it needed to be. And in that moment I understood something. With complete certainty, they had believed I was a burden in this house. But now, for the first time, they understood exactly who it belonged to.